Hi guys, Coach Luke here with our first Ask a SBS Coach video series, and I got you guys to ask me some questions a few Sundays ago, and we was looking at specifically nutrition for fat loss. So I'm going to go through the questions now. We had a ton of questions, quite a few from our own clients, so we've answered them on our closed group on Facebook. So let's get started. So first question up is from Jursone, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. And Laura's asked, could you please discuss metabolic rate and ways to increase it? So we're looking at fat loss. So I wouldn't say a way would be to increase it as such, because that's going to be pretty much impossible when you're in a deficit. It'd be the way you can reduce the negative adaptations to dieting and how you can reduce the negative effects of that. So a few things would be to make sure that you've given yourself enough time if you're going to compete or a specific goal in mind, that you try and eat as much as possible when starting out while losing weight. So in terms of a ballpark figure which I use is 0.5 to 1% per body weight, and the more body fat that person has, the closer it will be to that 1% mark at the start, and the leaner that individual is, it will be closer to 0.5%. Other things you can look at is a whole diet break. So there's a study, I think Wing and others, on 2003, where they had different groups, and those which planned a diet break, actually there was no significant difference over the 11-month period when they had a diet break. So that could be something you could incorporate in there, just to help obviously with your hormones, and especially like leptin, testosterone, which would decrease when in a deficit. So a full diet break would be probably your best bet, but depends on how much time you've got and how much body fat you've got to drop. You could use refeeds. That will have an acute effect with leptin, and they also have a purpose in terms of replenishing your glycogen stores as well, so that can help with your performance in the gym. It just gives you that little thing of not being in it, feeling like you're in a diet 24/7, 7 days a week. So in terms of increasing your metabolic rate, again, when dieting is going to be hard, it's more of sort of like a damage limitation. So be smart, don't go for a rapid fat loss, eat as much as possible while doing as minimal as possible while hitting that 0.5 to 1% mark, and then when you hit a plateau, you can either obviously drop some calories or increase your energy expenditure. So hopefully that answered that question. So moving on, because we've got quite a few. Next one's from Phillip Robson, and Andrew's asked, how much do carb sources matter when in a caloric deficit, as long as the individual has had sufficient fibre and micronutrients? So if they're getting sufficient fibre and micronutrients and everything's hit, one, you've got to look at, are they actually sufficient in the first place, or are they on the lower side? If they are where they should be, then carb sources really, if you've hit all your fibre and micronutrients, then they should just be down to personal preference. If you want to have a bit of people say unclean food, then again, feel free to have that, as long as you said, you have hit those. Then it would be down to personal preference. Always when dieting as well, I'd always try and get someone to use a variety of carb sources. One, so it's not as boring and there's good variety in the diet. And two, that each carb source will have different micronutrient profiles as well. So you're making sure you're not creating any deficiencies as well. Next question from Alex Roche. When starting a cut, how many calories would you suggest reducing your maintenance calories, and how long would you wait before reducing them again? Thanks. So what I tend to do is set some maintenance macros, and I'll get the client who's just signed up to hit those macros and track their weight. So if their weight's maintaining, then that's good. I've guessed it right. That's one of the good things if it does get guessed right, which is unlikely. First of all, if there's a slight decrease in weight with those macros, then I know, okay, it's in a deficit. They may be in like a 5 to 10% deficit. If they're putting on weight, then I know they're probably around, they're obviously in a caloric surplus. So it's all about getting that data in the first place. First of all, starting the cut, I'd always get them to eat as many calories as possible. So I'd try to get them maybe on like a small deficit while hitting that 0.5 to 1% I mentioned earlier, and then looking at obviously minimal energy expenditure. So if I can get away with no cardio, then that would be a good start. Sometimes you may have to put a little bit in. So in terms of when I would wait to reduce them again, if they've plateaued, which is a good thing, because it just shows that their body's adapting. Depends on whether it's their new training mesocycles coming up. I tend not to change like training and macros at the exact same time, so I can see which is working best. So if they've got a new training split coming up, and that's going to create, maybe it's going to be more of a volume mesocycle, and that's going to create more of an energy expenditure. I'd see how the new training mesocycle works for that week, and that may just kickstart things again. It could be I'd drop maybe like 20 to 25 grams of carbs, maybe a little bit of fat, or a bit from both, and then it could also be just adding maybe some HIIT at the end of a session in the form of like some bike sprints or some low intensity steady state cardio. I don't have any preference. What I tend to do is look at the person in terms of their lifestyle and what they're currently doing exercise wise, and then I'd probably not rotate as such, but either take it from their diet and create more of a deficit there, or increase their energy expenditure through just increasing volume with training slightly, or adding some CV resistance in. So hopefully that answered your question. Next question, Dzenan Satrovic. Apologies if I get it wrong again. So Dzenan said, pros and cons of a high fat diet. They put around 75% for endomorphs. He said, I think there are a lot of us who can't lose pounds on a standard diet, like 2 grams per pound of protein, 15 to 30% of fats, and resting carbs. So I can't see many pros of it being 45% of a fat diet, even if you are an endomorph. And what I would like to say as well is the whole somatotype thing really annoys me as well, purely because when you go through different stages of your life, I was an ecto, then I was a meso, then I was an endomeso because I had a child. So we always say that everyone's an individual, but why do we group them into 3 categories? So if we look at the research, there's no research out there which I know which actually supports somatotypes and changing their training and nutrition. Now people have different body fat levels, and the more fat body fat you have, the more likely you will have an insulin resistance, so you may perform better on a higher fat diet and lower carb. Another thing you've got to take into account is their activity levels, what they are currently and what you're actually going to be getting them to do. So for me, I used to go down the route of, okay, your body fat's quite high, so I'm just automatically going to give you low carbs and high fat because of insulin. But insulin doesn't make you fat. You've got to look at basically the net balance at the end, not just the day, over a period of time. So the main things would be is to create the diet where it's got sufficient protein, and the carbs and fat will be based on personal preference. If you're going to give someone a diet and they prefer carb sources, but then you take them all away, and then you're giving them resistance training, which is glycogen depleting, then they might not adhere to it. It might not work for them. So for example, I have some overweight clients who do well on a lower carb diet. However, when I've used that approach with a few others, they've not done that well. So then I've reverted and I've gone, okay, I'm going to give you a lower fat diet and higher carb diet. And guess what? That worked for them. So it's working out what works for that individual. So in terms of like 45% of fats as well, you've then got to take into account overall calories as well. So I tend to go by grams per kilogram of body weight rather than a percentage. So you'd probably say like a low fat diet would be sub 20%, getting to around the 15% mark. And if we look at the research as well, which is in controlled metabolic wards, when the protein's set and it's maintained, and you just change around the carbs and fat, even with that individual, as long as there's a deficit, there's no significant difference in terms of weight loss. So again, it's looking at things like the person's diet previously. So if it's a typical Western diet, then they probably have had quite a lot of carbs in there. So if you eliminate carbohydrates, then guess what? They're going to lose weight because you've just eliminated a ton of calories from that. So I'll just say play around with it, experiment and find out which works for you, but don't just assume that because someone has a higher body fat percentage, they're not going to lose weight on a higher carb diet and lower fat diet. So hopefully that helps. So Vag Koul, do you go for a healthy fat loss journey, although the results will be slower, or for faster results no matter the collateral damage in a given strict deadline? Whenever possible, always go for the slower approach. We look at the research as well. When the rate of weight loss is high or the caloric deficit is large, then the negative adaptations of dieting occur at a lot quicker rate and to a more severe degree as well. So if we look at like research with adaptive thermogenesis, which is the drop in calories which cannot be accounted for in the drop of lean tissue, and I think the biggest one which reported adaptive thermogenesis is the Biggest Loser study, and it was around 18.8%. I know this because I've done a webinar last night on metabolic adaptation. So, and they lost on like a 4.22 pounds per week average over, I think, a 30-week period. So that's a big drop in itself. So whenever possible, always go for the 0.5 to 1%, and again, base it on the person's current body composition. And then if you do, for whatever reason, if you do need to do it quickly, maybe what I've used before is Lyle McDonald's rapid fat loss just for a week. It's had quite good results, but again, it's a high protein diet, and there's supplements as well to take into account, as well as adjusting their training volume, etc. So, or when always possible, sit down with the client and explain to them that slow and steady is the best option if we're looking at long-term results. Otherwise, you go quick and go for a rapid fat loss, and you cut calories, cut cardio, and then once they hit a plateau, what are you going to do then? So always slow and steady if possible. So next question is from Kelly Joanne Plummer, and Kelly said, "Hi Luke, how low would you go for a male/female competitor? What is the lowest you like clients on?" So I'm going to take that as calories, and I'll answer it in a second. There's a few questions here. How do you bring in refeeds, and how many a week? What are the advantages and disadvantages for refeeds? For weight loss, do you prefer being in cardio or bringing in cardio or reducing calories? So I've got my notes here, Kelly, so if I'm looking down, you know why. So if we take into calories, you've got to base it on the person's body weight and their sort of body fat percentage, or their energy availability, which would be how much body fat stores they've got. A few times clients have come to me who want to compete within like 8 to 12 weeks, and they've just got a ton of body fat, and they tell me they're on like 1400 calories and they're maintaining weight. One, they're probably not on 1400 calories and maintaining weight when they're doing a ton of exercise. And if they are on that low and their metabolic rate has adapted to that degree and they still need to lose a ton of body fat, I will either say I won't coach them because it would not be safe for their health. And I mean, when getting down to low levels of body fat, it's never you can't really say it's good for your health. But when they come and they've got already eating low calories and doing a ton of cardio and resistance training, and they've still got quite a lot of body fat to drop within a short period of time, I would either refuse to coach them or change their perspective, talk them through the process, and maybe set a date further down the line. So in terms of low, I mean, when people say they're on 800 calories a day, they may be for 1 or 2 days, but when hunger sets in, that's when they're going to binge. So low wise, maybe around 1300 calories, 1400 calories for someone who's low body weight, someone who's high body weight, maybe like the late 1900s. But again, everyone's different, and that's the good thing about coaching. Some people will have to work hard and create a massive deficit compared to their body weight, which you would presume their maintenance would be. and some people can drop calories on 3,500 calories and they're around 90 kg, so it does depend on the person. Refeeds. So I tend to, the pros and cons of refeed. So a con of refeeds is that it cuts into your deficit. So if it was maybe like a 10 or 15% deficit and you had a big refeed, it may obviously make it from 15 to 10% or 10% to 5%. So that would be a con. Also, when people, other factors you need to take into account is how many calories are they actually on, and how many carbs are they on. Do they really need to refeed if they're on like 400 grams of carbs per day? Probably not, because they're getting as well as a good amount of calories. So I tend to use refeeds when the person's more leaner, because they've got their leptin levels will tend to be lower because they've got less body fat and energy availability. If they've been dieting for a longer period of time, then using a refeed can also have an acute effect on leptin. I'm not sure how much of an effect that would have based on just like a 1 or 2 meals or a day period. But another good thing about a refeed is, as I said previously, it replenishes glycogen stores, so it can help with your performance in the gym. I tend to not just go with like, I'll have a refeed on a leg day because you're going to smash your legs. There's too many things to take into account, like the time of day they're training, and then their preference as well. So I tend to speak to the client and work out when would they like to have their refeed. If it can be on a workout day, then good. If it isn't, and it's on a Friday or Saturday because they've got a family and they would like to maybe have a bit more flexibility with the dieting and macros, then I'd put it on that day. In terms of the how far I'd go up to, probably briefly go up to what I presume is their maintenance level. You could do, Alan Aragon's got a good thing with like carb ups, and you could do maybe 1.5 to 2.5 times their carbohydrate intake for the week per day. You could maybe go with 2 smaller refeeds, maybe every four days when the person's quite lean as well. And a refeed as well is just going to make you feel a little bit better that you're not dieting 24/7, 7 days a week. So there's some of the pros of a refeed. If possible, again, like I said, having a full diet break for a week could be another possibility, and that could work well. So for your last question, you said, for weight loss, do you prefer bringing in cardio or reducing calories? I prefer doing whatever I feel would be most beneficial for that person. If they're currently doing a lot of cardio or a lot of training anyway, or they're quite active on a day-to-day basis with a lot of walking or cycling to work, then I'd probably prefer to take it from their diet. If their calories are getting a little bit lower, and I think I'd rather create more of a deficit through increasing energy expenditure, then I'd probably bring in more cardio. So again, it would be based on the individual. Okay. So next question, Candice, AUM, I'm sorry I don't know how to pronounce your surname. Candice has asked, is there any evidence suggesting that spacing meals further apart supplements fat loss? I know that end of day net is most important, but I was wondering if fewer larger meals makes a difference. So I haven't seen any research. If we look at meal frequency and what people perceive, or the bros in the industry, or people which are still bros, would say that having a higher meal frequency will elevate your metabolism. Research has proven this over and over again that this is not the case. So what I would suggest is, again, as you answered the question, the net at the end of the net day, I wouldn't just say the day, but over a period of time, maybe a week or so, being in a negative balance would obviously promote fat loss. So when you've got to look at meal frequency, things you need to take into account is personal preference, your activity levels, and what's actually going to make you stick to the plan. So for me personally, I prefer, if I'm in a deficit, I would prefer 3 larger meals spread out through the day. Sometimes I may even have 2 meals and just intermittent fast, because I've spent quite a lot of my time on the laptop now. So to get work done, it may just be like intermittent fast up until 12 o'clock, and then I have like 2 larger meals and maybe a dessert or some sorts. That works better for me in terms of having 5 or 6 smaller meals. And then the other things you've got to take into account as well is if you're spending your time prepping 8 meals a day, and you're on like, not unless you're on like massive amount of calories, if you're eating quite a lot of calories, then it may be that more smaller frequent meals would be better, because it's quite a large amount of calories to consume. Where if your calories are probably average, or if you're on the cut, as obviously it's the fat loss questions, then it may be doing like 8 small meals a day. It's just going to be so small that you're going to eat it and then want more all the time. And another thing to take into account, the amount of food prep. So for me, the less food prep I can do, the easier for me. So again, there's no research out there which would suggest spacing the meals further apart for fat loss. Again, you've got to look at the overall net balance, and then picking a meal frequency which promotes adherence to the diet, and also looking at what works best for you and your maybe your work shifts and stuff like that. So hopefully that answered that. Next question, Joe Morris. So Joe said, should the macronutrient composition of a meal differ based on the individual's circadian rhythm / time of the day? I'm going to say no, it should differ based on the person's preference and overall macros, and making sure that once overall macros are hit, that's the most important thing. So worrying about your circadian rhythm and just forgetting to hit your overall macros sort of defeats the object. So make sure you master the basics first, hit your calories, hit your macros, and then look at what fits your lifestyle best. So again, with people's circadian rhythm and stuff like that, if someone works late shifts, their body clock's going to be different to someone who works early shifts. And then I've got some clients who work early, medium, or like afternoon shifts and evening shifts. So we would talk and discuss and go through what maybe adapting their nutrition to suit their shift patterns. So I wouldn't, I mean, you may be going on about like the whole meat and nuts for breakfast and stuff like that. I'll link you a good article from my friends Matt Jones on that, which basically just explains maybe why meats and nuts for breakfast is not the best option or the only option. And again, who really wants to be getting up and having, people think, oh, you have carbs in the morning, you're going to get brain fuzz and you won't be able to concentrate properly. That's a load of rubbish. What tends to happen is they compare a high carb, low protein breakfast compared to a high fat, high protein breakfast. So the key would be the protein as well. And again, times of day you're training as well. So some of my clients may tend to have a higher fat and higher protein breakfast if they're training later in the evening, so I can get more carbohydrates around their training to aid performance and recovery. Where some of my clients train first thing in the morning, so it may just be like a smoothie, so more carbohydrates and protein. So yeah, I would adapt it to you as the individual rather than the circadian rhythm. So Mike, well, hi Mike. Mike always asks questions, so good on Mike. How to determine macros, calories and ratios when beginning a fat loss phase? I'll keep it simple. Get an estimate of resting metabolic rate. I tend to use 23 times their body weight in kilograms. Then estimate their total daily energy expenditure, taking into account their physical activity levels, doing the calculations. Set protein, set fat, remainder is made up of carbs. You then take, obviously that's a guesstimate, you then get the client to adhere to their macros, get them to try and like a maintenance tracker. You then take that data, it gives you the information of roughly there or thereabouts. And other things to take into account is the personal preference. So if someone prefers to have more carbohydrate sources, I tend to have less, give them a lower fat diet. If someone prefers to have a higher fat diet, I would tend to give them a lower carb diet and higher fat, and tweak. It may not, that diet may work for them at that moment of their life with their current body composition, and it doesn't mean it has to be set in stone, and it doesn't mean you have to have meat and nuts for breakfast every single day. You can have meat and veg or meat and nuts one day, and you can have oats and whey the next day. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't really matter as such, but that's how I'd do it. So hopefully that answers that. Moving on, because we've still got a few to get through. James Walker, after a long cut / contest prep, do you have to recalculate your total daily energy expenditure? Now your body weight is less. Thanks. Yes, James, you do. Your metabolic rate will reduce. It's metabolic adaptation. It adapts to the stimulus you place it under. If you've been in a deficit for a long period of time, then your body will adapt. So what was once your maintenance level will not be, because your body weight's less. There may be some adaptive thermogenesis. But with adaptive thermogenesis, there's some research which says it does occur at like quite a big rate, and there's some which suggests it doesn't. And key factors to take into account whether adaptive thermogenesis will occur are those which tend to have a high protein diet, don't have as much adaptive thermogenesis. Though the research which is done where they only either don't prescribe any resistance training, or they only do cardiovascular, as in walking, tends to be a higher adaptive thermogenesis rate than those which do a progressive overload resistance training protocol. So I think you just got to come to terms with that. Your maintenance is no longer 3,000 calories, for example, and it may be 2,000 calories because you've been dieting and your body weight's less, and your body fat levels are down, and your hormones are down regulated as well. And research is showing that your NEAT, so your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is subconsciously, so like fidgeting, moving around. So as I'm doing this now, my NEAT's probably more than someone else's, or maybe less than someone else's, like James Layton. Shout out to James, who loves to use his hands when he records. And that tends to decrease when you're been in a larger deficit for a longer period of time, because your body's not designed to look good or get shredded and be on stage in your skin piece. It's trying, obviously, like a survival mechanism to hold on to body fat. So when you get down to a certain level, so yeah, it will adapt. Just take that into account and have a good reverse diet in place. And there's quite a lot of psychological things afterwards of competing which need to be taken into account. So Ash Evans, what are your views on using carb backloading as part of muscle gain plan? High protein fat up until workout, usually around 1 PM, then maybe some carbs intra-dependent on workout length, and the majority of carbs post. So again, that's taking into account you're going to be training later on in the day. What if you train in the morning? We could go on quite a lot about carb backloading. There are plenty of flaws in it. I wouldn't say it's optimal for muscle gain. I wouldn't say this diet is great for everything, or like this is the best. Do you know what I mean? Because there's no best of anything. It's whatever's best for that individual and that person at the time. So what I'm going to do, Ash, is I'm going to link you to my good friend Joseph Agu. He's wrote a really good piece on carb backloading. Have a read of that, and anyone else also have a read and make some comments on the blog. So Candice again, I've mainly heard that refeed surpluses should primarily be a boosting carbs and lowering fat as much as possible. Are there any drawbacks of a general caloric surplus in all macros rather than just carbs? Either way, how high should a refeed surplus be? So I'd say like a refeed would be around maintenance. You can maybe go slightly over a bit. Again, what you want to make sure is that you are in an overall caloric deficit for that period of time, if we're going by like a week period. So you don't want to go like stupidly overly high with a refeed and then either go back to maintenance or a slight surplus. So like when people tend to binge, they binge and they may have been in a deficit for 5 days, 6 days, and then they go on a massive binge and then create that surplus, especially if someone's got a lower body weight and a lower total daily energy expenditure in the first place. So if we look at leptin itself, again, if you look at the research, carbohydrate seems to be the main one which would increase leptin levels. So it makes sense to add on the carbohydrates from your macros to create obviously that refeed. Some people may drop fat a little bit just so they can up the carbs, not because carbs and fat together are going to make you fat, but because just so they could get a little bit more carbs in. But if you want to keep it simple, keep everything the same, just add more carbohydrates up until around your maintenance level. and that would probably be how I'd work a refeed. So next question, Chris Gregory. How long to eat before bed or having carbs before bed and workouts to prevent blunting growth hormone production? Also, thoughts on the best way to get lean gains in regards to fasted slow intensity cardio or HIIT. So there really is little point of trying to optimise your growth hormone post-workout to maximise your hypertrophy gains. Again, there's no strong evidence at all that acute hormonal response within a physiological range, not injecting here, actually has much effect in terms of hypertrophy gain. So you'll be better off just eating normally. There's no point trying to maximise a workout to just elevate your hormones to get hypertrophy when it sort of, if it means that you're not progressively overloading throughout and in a surplus. So I wouldn't worry about that, Chris. In terms of lean gains, again, you just got, people tend to you got to keep it sensible, and people tend to go on like dirty bulks and they just put on muscle but then they put on fat, and then they go in an extreme cut and then they lose the fat and lose the muscle again because they've gone too extreme with the deficit. So it would vary based on the person's body composition and their training age and how close they are to their potential. For someone who's more advanced, probably 0.5 to 1 pound per month increase in weight. For someone who's an intermediate, 1 to 2 pounds. For someone who's a beginner, maybe 2 to 3 pounds per month. Or you could use maybe a percentage base. I know Alan Aragon uses like a percentage based as well, where if you begin around like the 1 to 1.5%, intermediate would be obviously 0.5 to 1%, I think. Then advanced would be around the 0.25% of their body weight. So that's another thing you can look at. In terms of your last question, and fasted slow intensity or cardio or HIIT, I wouldn't recommend anyone doing probably HIIT, proper HIIT, not your 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, because that is not HIIT. If you're going to do proper HIIT, then you probably don't do that fasted. And my other good friend and colleague Brad Schoenfeld is actually doing with Alan Aragon a study looking at fasted cardio and non-fasted cardio. So until this date, there's no benefits as such over a period of time. So you may use more fat as your source, energy source during it, but post workout, I don't know, maybe your performance will be lower because you are fasted. So I'm going to hold judgment until the research is published, but I'd say there wouldn't be any difference for whether it's fasted or non-fasted. Last question, boom, Cordell Wilson. Hello Cordell. Do you ever prescribe aggressive fat loss diets if clients do not care about muscle retention and strength loss but want quick results? As I said previously, I always try and deter people from going down that approach. I have used large rapid fat loss on a few occasions, whether it's someone's going on holiday or something's coming up or an event. And as I said previously, obviously there's certain protocols and you'd only do it for like a short period of time, like a week period of time. And you will lose, I've had clients who lose 10 to 12 pounds during a week. And again, I'm not saying they've lost 10 to 12 pounds of fat. They've probably lost a few, but most of that will just be water weight because they're glycogen depleted, because they're pretty much on really low carbohydrates. And when they do start to eat properly again, that weight will go up. So if on special occasions, maybe, but doing it, making sure that it's only for that week period, but always trying to get your client to have the mindset of not just quick results, because again, people, when we look at our industry, it's always like 8 weeks or 10 weeks or 12-week transformation. But then what happens after the 8 weeks? Do you know what I mean? You may, if you're on a diet and you can't see yourself doing it forever and being able to stick with it, then it's not the right diet you're on. And even the word diet itself has a stigma to it, because people think diet, they assume is a short-term thing. So trying to change your client's mindset is the best. best way to go. So guys, that's 35 minutes, which is quite long. Thanks for your questions. We will be doing our next Ask a SBS Coach very soon, maybe Sunday night coming, and it'll be on a specific topic again. Please feel free to subscribe to our Shredded by Science YouTube channel and leave any comments in the section below. Cheers guys, thank you.